the University of Notre Dame. My colleague Tom Carsey, who is somewhat blessedly off camera, he is at the University of North Carolina. Our paper is entitled, "Is Conflict Still Extending?" The answer is yes. So that's, I'm going to sit down now. We have some earlier work published between the years of 2002 and 2010. And in that work, we argue that recent party polarization has been characterized not by the old realignment literature's conventional wisdom of conflict displacement, but by what we call conflict extension. More specifically, the argument is that there are at least three distinct policy dimensions in domestic American politics: social welfare issues, issues of race and civil rights, and cultural issues. And as polarization has been growing on the newer issue dimensions, like the cultural issues, we might expect polarization to decline on the older issue agendas, but in fact it has not. It has been growing on all three. It's extended from the old to the new. And that's true among both party activists and mass party identifiers. Our earlier work stops at 2004. We would like to write a book about the conflict extension process. So we're not just presenting our greatest hits here. We're not quite REO Speedwagon at the State Fair, which, by the way, if you've ever seen the Speedwagon at the State Fair, is awesome. We are extending our analysis through the most recent presidential election to see if the process and our explanation of the process still holds. Our argument is a lot more complicated than one slide. There's subtle differences between how it works at the party activist level and the mass party identifier level, but we've only got 10 to 12 minutes here, so I'm going to present it in a nutshell. Our argument is that activists and the party's mass coalitions are able to grow more polarized on these multiple policy dimensions because of party-based issue conversion, because of individual party identifiers and activists merging their attitudes on these multiple distinct dimensions together toward the ascendant, consistently liberal or consistently conservative positions in their parties. And as individual members grow more consistent on these various issue dimensions, party polarization can grow on both a newer issue agenda and an older one. So party polarization on these multiple policy agendas should be accompanied by growing attitude constraint, by increasingly consistent attitudes among activists and the electorate on these multiple issue agendas. But that growing constraint should occur only among those who are committed to a party. Those are the only people who are going to take cues from these increasingly ideologically extreme positions of party leaders or platforms. Those are the only people who might have an incentive to bring their own views closer to those of the parties. And so at the mass level, of course, that's people who identify with the party, especially strong partisans. At the activist level, we have argued that that would be activists who have a particularly high level of commitment to their party. Also in the mass electorate, this growing attitude, constraint, consistency should really only occur among party identifiers who are aware of party differences, of the Republicans being more conservative than the Democrats on multiple policy dimensions. If you don't know that these things now all fit together, that opposing abortion and opposing taxes fits together, for example, then there's no reason for you to merge those opinions together on your own. To test our argument, we use two primary sets of data. At the activist level, we use the longest running series of surveys on party activists, which are the convention delegate studies from 1972 to 2012. Most of you are probably familiar with those. From 72 to 92, they were conducted by Warren Miller and Kent Jennings and some of their colleagues. Since 2000, they have been conducted by lesser lights, including Tom and me. In 2012, we, like the earlier surveys, contacted all of the delegates for whom we had valid mailing addresses by mail, but this time we didn't ask them to complete a mail survey. We asked them to complete an online survey through a Qualtrics link. And in fact, 745 Democrats and 483 Republicans did that. At the mass level, of course, we use the American National Election Studies, which really need no introduction. Our first question is, before we examine party polarization on these multiple policy dimensions, is, are there multiple policy dimensions? Are there still distinct social welfare, racial, and cultural issue attitudinal dimensions among party activists and in the mass electorate? If there are not, if there's only one overarching dimension of ideological conflict, then we don't have a paper or a book. We don't need to ask whether there's been conflict displacement or conflict extension. There's only one dimension of conflict. If there are multiple dimensions, then we can ask whether party polarization on one dimension has been associated with growing or declining polarization on other dimensions. So, this is for activists to see if, in fact, this is multidimensional, racial, social welfare, and cultural issues. We ran confirmatory factor analyses. We compared a 3-factor model with those issues loading on separate dimensions, as you see here, to a 1-factor model, one overarching ideological dimension, or a 2-factor model where the racial and social welfare issues loaded together. And the most important statistic here is the chi-square difference test, which tests the significance of the difference between a model with more latent factors and fewer latent factors. And in fact, those chi-square difference tests are quite significant, both for all delegates, for Democrats by themselves, and for Republicans by themselves. So these issue dimensions, especially among party activists, are highly related to each other, but they do appear to be distinct. To assess whether party polarization has grown on those distinct issue dimensions, all we did was include a dummy variable for party, coded 1 for Republicans, 0 for Democrats, in our 3-factor confirmatory model, and allowed it to affect each of the latent factors. And these are, in fact, the coefficients which indicate the difference between the party means on these dimensions from 1972 to 2012. And you can see that, well, in 1972, the parties were not very polarized on cultural issues like abortion, legalizing marijuana, the ERA, but quickly they became quite polarized, and they have become more and more different on the cultural dimension over time. But at the same time, in keeping with our conflict extension argument, party polarization has not declined on older dimensions like race and social welfare. In fact, it has grown. It has continued to increase on both of those dimensions. Our argument is that this growing party polarization on multiple dimensions should be accompanied by greater attitudinal or ideological consistency. So we should see more Republican activists who are consistently conservative, more Democratic activists who are consistently liberal. To trace that, we need to have the same issues measured in the exact same way over time. Unfortunately, in the convention delegate studies, there are not a lot of those kinds of questions, but we do have them from 1992 through 2012 on abortion and government social welfare spending. And so we've divided activist positions on these issues into 5 categories. You're pro-choice on abortion, you're liberal on social welfare, pro-choice or conservative, pro-life and liberal, pro-life and conservative, or you're moderate on at least one of those dimensions. And you can see the growing ideological consistency, especially among Democrats. The percentage of Democrats who are both pro-choice on abortion and liberal on social welfare has increased dramatically. The percentage of Republicans who are pro-life and conservative has also increased. 3 minutes, okay. I'll skip this slide then. In the electorate, we also find distinct attitudinal dimensions, same kind of confirmatory model, same way of measuring party differences, And again, you see here a pattern of clear conflict extension, party polarization increasing on the newer cultural issues, but also increasing on older issue agendas, the social welfare agenda, the racial issue agenda. Again, we think that should be associated with increasing attitudinal constraint across these issues. Here we go back to 1988, we have 7 social welfare, cultural, and racial issues. We examine the average correlation of respondents on those 7 issues. We expect that that should increase among partisans and not so much among independents. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. Among independents, there's no increase in attitude constraint. Among partisans, especially strong partisans, there's quite a bit of increase. You might argue that, well, you've got cross-sectional data. What you are showing me here could just as easily be what the literature is called sorting, that consistent conservatives have become Republicans, consistent liberals have become Democrats. Party isn't causing anything. And you would be right, because we can't really judge causality based on this cross-sectional data. So we have some panel data here. This is the 2008-2009 ANES panel. We looked at people who in both January and October of 2008 had the same party ID and the same strength of party ID. And then we looked at their correlation on a handful of social welfare, cultural issues. And what we find is if you're a pure independent, you don't grow more constrained, you actually grow less constrained over the course of the 2008 campaign. If you're a weak or leaning partisan, you grow a bit more constrained. If you're a strong partisan, you do seem to bring your attitudes on those multiple dimensions closer together in a noticeable way. Finally, our argument is this should really only be happening among partisans who are aware of partisan policy differences, who understand that the parties are polarized on these multiple dimensions. The Republicans are to the right of the Democrats. And so here with the 2012 ANES survey, we break our partisan groups down by awareness on abortion and social welfare, a combination of providing health insurance and government providing jobs. And then we break those down into you're aware that the Republicans are more conservative on neither, you're aware on only one, you're aware on both. And what we find is that really we only see noticeable constraint and a significant increase among partisans who understand that the Republicans are more conservative on both dimensions. And that's especially the case for strong partisans.
Time's expired.
So, the end. Just to sum up, I would say that conflict has still extended. Our argument about party-based issue conversion, individual activists and identifiers bringing their attitudes together in response to their partisanship still seems to hold. So now we're going to go write a book. Thank you.